DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
Start your day tomorrow with The Daily Dog with Michelle Forto, the morning podcast on DogWorks Radio. Apple Podcast reviewer Patty Christensen calls it funny, smart, and filled with all the info I want to know about dogs. I love this show. Wake up with The Daily Dog. Available on DogWorks Radio on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. And you can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. You can find us over on social media on Dogworks Radio. And I am joined today by my co-host. His name is Alex Stein, calling in from California. Alex, how's it going?
It's going great, Robert. I'm just beginning to get my sleeping pattern back to where it should be after Iditarod, and just has been a very, very exciting race season here.
It has, and for folks that may just be jumping into our show here, Alex was up in Alaska for the start of the Iditarod, and the day before, he went out on his first sled dog ride ever, fell off the sled, dislocated and broke his shoulder and humerus bone, and has been not only recovering from that, but also, as he said, the trials and tribulations of a hardcore Iditarod fan. We were talking off air about how that's healing up, and it's been, about a month now, Alex, and things are progressing okay?
Yeah, it's just about a month, and it is looking good. I wish I had a magic wand so it would be instant, but I don't have one right now.
Well, every sport has some sort of battle scar. And, I've got a lump in my nose from playing hockey and a chipped tooth from playing lacrosse. I guess you have a true battle scar from mushing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and, it's funny because when I talk to people who are actual mushers or who have competed in races, and I tell them what happened, they all say to me, "Oh yeah, okay, well, that's what happens."
Well, at least you did not break your pelvis like our friend Cindy Abbott did, and then go on with that broken pelvis for about 700 miles in the Iditarod race. I don't think neither you or I have much to cry about, do we?
No, and it's funny because I ran into Cindy Abbott after this happened, and I was out on the trail, and I really just wanted to complain to somebody about how much pain I was in, and I looked up and there was Cindy Abbott, and I thought, I can't really complain considering what she's been through.
If it was anybody else, they probably would have been sympathetic, but I guess that was just the wrong person at the wrong time for your crying on somebody's shoulder.
Yeah. So I know we have a lot of people talking about changes in either the structure of Iditarod itself, the structure of the Iditarod Trail Committee, and just there's been a lot of interesting discussion since the race ended about things that could be done to change or improve things. And I know that Jeff King, four-time Iditarod champ Jeff King, has been having a series of conversations on his Facebook page that have some interesting suggestions for how the race might alter in the coming years.
What I found really interesting so far, and I'm not sure exactly how sort of the Iditarod board schedule works, in terms do they meet monthly or quarterly or whatever they do, but this, sort of perceived shakeup hasn't gained much ground yet. I know that they thought it was going to be, at least in terms of the media and the fans, they thought it was going to be almost immediately after Iditarod, some major announcement was going to be made. But here we are about a month or so into the year after Iditarod. Everything's sort of settling in now for the off season, and we have not heard anything about any form of shakeup, have we?
No, we haven't. And I'm looking at the schedule, and it seems like the next board of directors meeting is April 13th. So that's coming up. And then there's also a rules committee meeting on the 22nd, the 26th. So, maybe in in the next few weeks or so, there's opportunity for some things to really happen.
Right. And before we jump in and start talking about Jeff King's sort of proposals, we are not done with the mushing season up here in Alaska. I think it is either starting this week or possibly next. It might be next week. I'm not 100% sure. Is the Kobuk 440 that starts up in Kotzebue. It's a 440-mile race. It's the longest Iditarod qualifier up here in Alaska, and it's a doozy. Not only is it spring mushing, but it's way up north there in I guess that would be northwest Alaska, way north of Nome there, and we have some really interesting people that are running in that race. It's the typicals like Nick Pettit and Jesse. Jesse's last name? It's escaping me right now.
Jesse Royer?
Jesse Holmes is running in the race. Then we have a new person that's going to be in the race. She's been in our show before. She's an author and a very prolific person on social media, in particular on Twitter, our friend Blair Braverman, who is running the race as well. What are your thoughts on the Kobuk 440?
I must confess that I haven't followed it a lot in previous years, but it does seem like it's a very exciting race and a very exciting group of competitors. It's really interesting to me that Blair is running this race and is going to be thrown in there with a bunch of people who just have a lot more experience with longer distance races. So I look forward to seeing how she handles that, which I'm sure she'll handle it very well because she does seem to rise to the occasion most of the time.
Right. And you know what's interesting about the Kobuk 440, and we've talked a lot about this on the show, about what you need to do to qualify for the Iditarod. And the current rules state, since we're talking about changes in rules and rules that are already in effect with Iditarod, you have to have 750 miles of racing in order to be qualified as an Iditarod rookie. And it's very interesting to me, and I'm sure it's probably deliberate, that the Kobuk 440 just happens to be 10 miles shy of what it would take to qualify if another person had a 300-mile race in their pocket. Say they ran the Willow 300 or the Copper Basin or any of those other qualifiers here, the Northern Lights 300, which was canceled this year, but any of those typical 300-mile races would not allow a person to qualify if they did one of those and the Kobuk 440. I think that that's deliberate, and I could be wrong. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would have to think it's deliberate as well. And, I'm not sure that there's anything wrong with wanting people to have run more than 2 mid-distance races before they run an Iditarod. Everyone who we talk to who, as a rookie, almost all of them say, well, I thought I was prepared, and then I got out there, and there was a lot of stuff that I just had no idea was going to come at me. So, I'm a little bit old school in this, and I think that requiring people to have a little bit more experience is a good thing.
Right, and it's very difficult to jump in from a 200-mile race to a 300, then a 300-mile race to a 440, and then, of course, make that major leap from, a 400-plus mile race into Iditarod or Yukon Quest or whatever. And what I found it also interesting, since we were talking about Blair Braverman, she had a post, I believe it was on Twitter today, about how much it was going to cost to get her and her dogs up, and she was saying that the current rate is about 65 cents a pound, and it's going to cost about $1,800 just to get her dogs and the supplies, meaning the dog food and the drop bags and the sled and whatnot. But that does not include getting her or her handler, who I believe is her partner, up to Kotzebue, and that's obviously several $100 more. So well over a couple of $1,000 just to get to the starting line for that race. That's probably why you don't see a lot of the lesser-known mushers run this race, because it's so expensive to get up there and do.
Yeah, and it's as you mentioned earlier, it's late in the season, so a lot of people who are from outside of Alaska are going to be looking to be already home by then. Even inside Alaska, it's difficult and it takes a long time to get there. So, there's a lot of those issues that play into this. And I think you're right. That's probably why you don't see a lot of rookies entering it.
Right. So let's jump on over to what Jeff King was talking about. Shortly after Iditarod, probably a week or so after the race had ended, he posted a very concise thread on Facebook that mentioned some of his suggestions for some new rules. And I would like to preface that before we jump into this by him saying during Iditarod or shortly thereafter that he was very comfortable in the 20s where he finished the race this year. I believe he was like 24th or 25th place, somewhere around there, right, Alex? But he was comfortable being
right,
sort of there at the top of the middle of the pack, and now he has some changes, doesn't he? Or proposed changes.
Yeah, and proposed changes. And he started this by saying that he thought it was time that we had a real in-depth conversation about some of the Iditarod rules. And a lot of his changes were aimed towards giving dogs more rest. And so he had one proposed rule change. He was talking about making it mandatory that there was a more of an even run-rest ratio. He talked about, I believe, starting with fewer dogs, starting with 14 instead of 16 dogs. There was some discussion about not being able to drop dogs once you got on the coast, or possibly of having a limited number of dogs that you could drop on the coast. And then there was in some cases, a very active and spirited discussion of each of these suggestions.
Right, and one of those rules in particular talked about a mandatory 24 hours of rest somewhere along the coast. And as Iditarod fans know now, there is a mandatory 8-hour rest at White Mountain, sort of a getting everybody together before that final push, making sure that there aren't just dog-tired dogs out there in that last 70 miles or so. But he's proposing a little bit longer rest there, and I think as I was reading through the thread, it wasn't necessarily 24 hours in one spot. And remember, the coast starts at about Unalakleet, so it wasn't 24 hours in one spot, but at least averaged a 24-hour rest at some point from there to Nome. Am I correct on that?
And that rest would have to be taken in a checkpoint. So if you went past a checkpoint and then camped, that wouldn't count. You'd have to actually go in and be at the rest point. At the checkpoint for 24 hours, or for 16 hours in one place and 8 hours in another place. Which
right.
A lot of people have said that in terms of the amount of rest that dogs get on the coast, that it's not that different from what Jeff is suggesting, but that this would force them to take those rests in checkpoints.
Right. And again, I've never ran Iditarod, but I've spent plenty of time in race checkpoints myself, and it's an entirely different animal to be able to have your dogs rest well in a very busy checkpoint. And as we know, Unalakleet and White Mountain are very busy in terms of traffic coming in and out. Unalakleet is one of those hubs of Iditarod where flights can get in and out, so it's very active there. But the dogs, at least in my opinion, don't rest as well in a very busy checkpoint as they would in camping, even if it's just a few miles in or out of. That's sort of my preference. If it's not a mandatory stop, is I like to stop either right before or right after, maybe 5 or 10 miles out, and then I can kind of settle in there and sort of be on my own. Maybe there'll be a couple of mushers around doing the same thing, but it's not nearly as busy of sort of the the activeness of volunteers and vets and fans and media and all of that happening at one of the major checkpoints.
Right. And, I think that the further along the trail that we get each year, the more we see people camping and not just staying in checkpoints. And I'm never sure if it's because there's something going on in checkpoints or there's just more cabins or more of an opportunity in places to camp later on. But it definitely seems, especially once people get up towards the coast, that there's a lot more of people overshooting checkpoints and then camping a few miles outside or halfway in between.
Right. And another rule that really started quite a bit of discussion was a limit on 14 dogs at the start. And it had sort of two parts to that. One, you start with 14 and you have to finish. I believe he wanted to be finishing with 9. Is that correct, Alex?
Yeah. So I believe it's 9. Yeah.
So I think that's a great idea, starting with less dogs, especially for some of those less experienced mushers, is a big benefit, in my opinion. And I try to describe this when I talk to new mushers all the time. The bigger the dog team, the longer it takes to manage that dog team. And people will say only a couple of dogs shouldn't take that much longer. But if you put it a little bit in perspective, if you're starting with 16 dogs on Iditarod, that's going to take an hour and a half or so to do your chores after the dogs have eaten their meal. So after that meal is prepared, so that means massages and working with the feet and getting them settled and doing all that. Now, if you go down to an 8-dog team, say 3/4 of the way into the race, now you've cut down your camp chores in half. So not only does it take half as long to get those dogs settled, but that also provides them that much more opportunity to rest, but it also allows you, as the musher, that much more opportunity to rest as well. And what I thought was an excellent point on the thread, and I can't recall who said it, was that those extra 2 dogs allows a musher that may not be one of these really high-profile, high-financed dog kennels to have a much smaller kennel. And again, people think, oh, it's only 2 dogs, but those 2 dogs, if they are taken up by a caliber type dogs, meaning race dogs, that eliminates those extra dogs that are needed in the kennel that would potentially have to replace them. And it's sort of a one-to-one in most of these middle to the low, to the back of the pack type kennels. They have a string of 12, 14, 16 Iditarod dogs, and then they'll probably have about double that with dogs that are either too young or too old or retired or are not Iditarod caliber or whatever. So now they have at least 32 dogs in their yard with only 12, 14, or 16 dogs that are able to run. So if you cut that down even by 2, that now takes that Iditarod caliber team from 12 to let's say doubling that to 24 or 14 to 28. Now we've cut down 4 extra dogs in your kennel. Not only is that a little bit cheaper to take care of, but it's a heck of a lot easier to manage. Then, of course, it's sort of a domino effect. You have less dogs being sold and bought, less puppies being born because they have to replace these Iditarod dogs. It's sort of a cascading effect just by limiting these 2 dogs. So that's sort of a musher's perspective on that. What are your thoughts as a fan?
I think that I'm not sure that most people would notice, most fans would notice the difference between a 16-dog team and a 14-dog team. So if it would be easier and make the the sort of back of the packers or the rookies more competitive, I'm very much in favor of that. I think it would add an element of excitement to the race that maybe isn't.
For sure. And do you have any thoughts or concerns about what I talked about being less dogs in the dog yard and that sort of process that those extra dogs take, whether it be a 12-dog race or even a 16-dog race like Iditarod?
Well, I think like you said, it lets you have a slightly smaller kennel. So I think that's a good thing. It's also a lot of people who have small kennels will end up acquiring or borrowing dogs to fill out their team. And maybe if there's two less dogs on the team, maybe you don't have to do that. And then you can have all dogs that you know very well and and have a rapport with instead of mostly dogs you know very well and a few dogs that you don't know as well as you could.
And Danny Seavey had a great discussion about that very thing on a thread on Facebook early in the race, where he said that if you look sort of back in the stats, teams that had borrowed dogs or leased dogs or whatever did not do as well as dogs that, of course, they have bred or they know their entire lives. It's just that bonding part of it and how that works. And if I'm correct, Alex, I believe the Yukon Quest is a 14-dog limit, and I think most qualifiers, in particular here in Alaska, are either 12-dog limits or even possibly 10. I'm not sure about all of them, but I think the Willow 300, which is a relatively new race, that is a 14-dog limit. It's also a mass start, which is the only major qualifying race up here in Alaska where all of the teams start at once, and they all start with 14 dogs as well. So if they just sort of adopt what the Quest is doing, and I know it's apples to oranges there in terms of the race, if they were to adopt that 14-dog rule for a race that's somewhat similar, at least in terms of distance, if they could do it in the Quest, I think that they would have no problems doing it with Iditarod.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the one other rule change that Jeff talked about is actually going back to a rule that briefly was in effect and then was repealed, which is the rule that if a dog on your team dies, you are automatically disqualified. And I believe that was the rule in the late 1990s, and then Rick Swenson had a dog on his team who died, and he was disqualified, and there was a big uproar about that, and then the rule was repealed. But Jeff says that if we reinstated this rule, it might encourage people to look a lot more carefully at the health of their dogs, and that would be a good thing going forward.
I agree, and as you said, that's a tough rule to sort of put into place, because just sort of the logistics of what happens if a dog expires on the trail. There already are many rules on the books now of what needs to be done if it happens, meaning it has to be carried in the dog bag and zipped up so it cannot be seen, and all of these things that have to be done with the dog that does expire, unfortunately, if that happens on the trail. But it's an interesting thing to have somebody disqualified at that point. Number one is you cannot determine what the cause of death is right there at a remote checkpoint. If the dog were to expire, say, in the middle of two checkpoints, is where it often happens. And often these dogs expire for a couple of reasons. One, it's a genetic issue, typically a heart issue, or number two, aspiration, meaning they either engulf their food too fast, it goes into their lungs and they aspirate, or some type of lung issue or breathing issue. Very common is pneumonia in dogs. So a dog will have kennel cough and then develop fluid in their lungs, and that will cause pneumonia, and the dogs will die that way. And then, of course, there's other reasons as well. Way down on that list, I believe, is is some form of a musher's problem, meaning abuse or something of that effect. I don't think that that's occurred in a really, really long time. I think I can only recall one episode where that's ever been at least public in Iditarod, and that was a couple of decades ago. So I don't know. I'm kind of torn on this one on what should happen because you just don't know what happened to the dog, especially if it's in one of these checkpoints. What are your thoughts as a fan? I know that this is probably the biggest point of contention with Iditarod, especially with the animal rights folks saying that it's abusive to dogs and dogs shouldn't run and doing all this stuff. And I think that goes very well back to the dogs that die on the trail. So can you take a few minutes and sort of explain the fans' position on dogs dying in Iditarod, and then maybe your thoughts about the rule itself?
Yeah, well, it's always a very, very sad thing whenever this happens, and there were a few years in a row where there were no dog deaths at all, and that was really wonderful. So I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, it does seem like that would add another thing that would make the race more exciting and more competitive. But on the other hand, I look back at teams who have won Iditarod, and I can't recall, at least since I've been following the race, of team winning where one or more of their dogs died. So I almost wonder if this is a necessary rule, because it seems like if a dog on the team dies, it usually has such an effect on the musher that it kind of knocks them off their game and knocks them out of really being competitive.
That's interesting. And if you remember, what was it, last year before, the snow machine fiasco that was happening out there with Ali Zirkle and Jeff King, and one of Jeff's dogs died from that. I don't recall, did he continue the race? Did he scratch? I don't remember.
He continued. I think he might have eventually scratched. But he was, this was one of those cases where he was doing very, very well up until this happened, and then, understandably, it had a huge effect on.
Right.
I recall back in the early 2000s, one of the lead dogs on the Team Norway team died very far into the race. And the musher nearly dropped out, ended up continuing eventually, but went from being in, I think, first or second place to being out of the top 10.
Like I said, this is one of those that I struggle with. I think it's devastating for that to happen. I've been mushing since 1994, so 24 years, and I have never had a dog that has died while mushing, nor have I had one die on the trail, whether in training or a race. So I don't know how that feels. I can imagine it would be totally devastating for me. And all that went through it. And I probably would scratch myself if that were to happen to one of my dogs on the trail. But I don't know about the disqualification. Do you remember what some of the thoughts were from some of the commenters on that thread at all?
Yeah, there were a lot of people who thought that it would be a good idea, and an almost equal or maybe greater number who thought that the Iditarod would never implement this again after what happened with Rick Swenson.
Very quickly, one other sort of wrinkle in this rule thing is Jeff King proposed that you should finish with more dogs than you're required to now. And I believe right now the rule stands you have to finish with 5 dogs in harness. That means on the line, not in the dog bag or being carried in whatsoever. It has to be actually running in the team to be able to finish. And there was a lot of comments about that. I know some pretty high-profile mushers jumped in on that and said that this rule will also be one that never changes. They tried to do it years ago, and it developed quite a bit of a stink about that. And it's one of those ones that's not very popular about having more dogs finish. So if for fans that are listening, they may think, well, what's wrong with that, with having more dogs finish or all of your dogs finish that you start with? What are your thoughts as a fan with that about having more dogs finish in harness coming into Nome?
I think that it would require different strategies. So that might be very interesting. I also feel like I don't know if 8 is the exact number, but it also feels sometimes like 5, like it should be more than 5. And I think for a few years it was 6, and then it went down, and so it's something that has changed in the past and certainly could change in the future. But what I will say is there's always a certain amount of appreciation and admiration for someone who finishes with all of their dogs. And I know that some years it doesn't happen, but there are a lot of times where someone in kind of the middle to the back of the pack will finish with all of the dogs they started with. And I think that's something that people always have a little bit of extra appreciation for, no matter where that team finished.
Right. And very quickly, my thoughts on that is we've talked about it several times on the show, and in particular when we talk about Dallas Seavey, is he likes to finish with very small teams. He may get down into that 7, 6, 5 range, and that's a very deliberate part of his strategy, is to finish with those few dogs, because again, going full circle with this, it's much easier to maintain and take care of a much smaller team. Think about it. If you're finishing with 5 very strong dogs at the finish, that is 2/3 of the dogs that you started with are now dropped from the team, wherever they're dropped, whether it be early on in the race or later on in the race. That's 2/3 or more of your team that are no longer present in the team. And if you're finishing very strong with that little bit of dogs and coming in strong to the finish, I think that that's a very distinct strategy that some of these really top competitors are taking advantage of.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure what the different types of training would be, but I would imagine that you would train very differently if you knew that's the race you were going to run than if you were trying to run a race where you had all or almost all of your dogs finishing.
Right. So definitely stuff to talk about over the off season, and I'm sure this will develop as we progress on through into the summer, then into the fall, about if any of these rules will change. I think that it was a very good discussion that was brought up by Jeff King. He definitely knows his stuff. It just wasn't somebody that had some sour grapes about a rule or whatever, or just sort of wasn't happy with what was happening on the trail. It couldn't have been a better person to bring up these sort of bullet points or discussions to spark a conversation. Now, whether that will lead to anything is another story, but I think it was a great way to start off at least positive talks about the race in general as we head into the off season. Do you agree?
Oh, I absolutely agree, and you're right that Jeff is sort of in kind of a unique position to bring this stuff up. He's done a lot of innovation in terms of equipment and training, and is someone who is very, very well respected in the community. But also, I think now that he's sort of moved away from being right at the front of the pack, I think he's looking at this from a point of view of what would help the sport, and not just from a point of view of what would help me or what would help my team or my way of doing things.
Good stuff for sure. Alex, anything else you want to mention before closing?
Nope. Just keep an eye out for the Kobuk 440, which is starting up, and I guess we'll see you guys out on the trails.
Excellent. So on behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto for Mushing Radio. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.
Hi, this is Alex Stein, co-host of Mushing Radio on DogWorks Radio. We just completed our first storytelling season on the 1925 Serum Run. Almost 100 years later, the 1925 Serum Run is something that is still inspirational, amazing, and in many ways larger than life. We've gathered all of these episodes together on one page to make it easier for you to listen to them in order. Just go to dogworksradio.com/serumrun. That's SERUMRUN, no space, dogworksradio.com/serumrun. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to Dogworks Radio at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever it is that you go to listen to podcasts.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can take a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all of our DogWorks Radio sponsors and promotions in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook, like our Facebook page, and one last thing, please tell all of your friends by spreading the word about DogWorks Radio. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
DogWorks Radio is produced by Robert Forto. Logo art by Angry Squirrel Studios. DogWorks Radio is produced in conjunction with KVRF 89.7 in Palmer, Alaska.
For dog training advice, you can contact Alaska Dogworks at 907-841-1686 or visit their website at alaskadogworks.com. If you have a show idea or would like to be a guest, please contact us by sending an email to live@dogworksradio.com.